Evan Brooks stood up in the middle of the most important job interview of his life, looked the executive across the table directly in the eye, and said three words that should have destroyed everything. "I have to go." His phone was still vibrating in his pocket. 5 missed calls in 2 minutes. His daughter's school. Emergency contact. Possible injury. He didn't ask permission. He didn't apologize. He simply turned toward the door, leaving behind the corner office, the 6-figure salary, and his family's last chance at survival. What he didn't know was that the woman watching him leave, Victoria Hale, Vice President of Community Relations, was already reaching for her car keys. If you want to see how one impossible choice transformed a father's entire future, stay with me until the very end. And please, comment below with your city so I can see how far this story travels. Now, let me tell you what really happened that morning and why walking away from everything turned out to be the decision that saved it all. The morning had started with oatmeal. Evan Brooks stood at the stove in their small apartment kitchen, stirring the pot with methodical precision while his 8-year-old daughter Lily sat at the table behind him, her backpack already zipped and ready by the door. The oatmeal was the cheap kind, the store brand that came in the enormous canister, but Evan had learned over the past 2 years how to make it taste like something more. A little cinnamon, a drizzle of honey when they could afford it, and always served in the bowl with the painted sunflowers that had been her mother's favorite. "Dad, you're going to do great today," Lily said, her voice carrying that particular brightness that children use when they're trying to be encouraging. "You always do great." Evan glanced over his shoulder at her, this small person with Claire's eyes and his own stubborn chin, and felt something tighten in his chest. She believed in him completely, with the kind of unshakable faith that had no awareness of bank balances or eviction notices or the stack of rejection letters hidden in his desk drawer. "Thanks, Lil," he said, dividing the oatmeal between 2 bowls. He brought hers to the table, setting it down carefully. "But this one's important, really important." "They're all important," Lily said matter-of-factly, picking up her spoon. "But you're the best, so they'll definitely hire you." He wanted to believe her. The job was with Meridian Corporate Foundation, one of the largest philanthropic organizations in the city, and the position, Director of Community Outreach, was perfect. It matched his background, his skills, everything he'd built before Claire got sick, and the world had reorganized itself around hospital visits and treatment schedules, and eventually, grief. The salary would mean stability, security, the ability to stop choosing between Lily's field trip fees and keeping the heat on. But the interview was in 90 minutes, and Evan could feel the weight of it pressing down on his shoulders like physical force. "Eat your breakfast," he said gently, sitting across from her with his own bowl. "Mrs. Patterson will pick you up for school today, remember? I'll get you this afternoon." "I know," Lily said, swinging her legs under the table. "She said she'd let me help with her garden this weekend if the weather's nice. Can I?" "Of course." Evan watched her eat, memorizing this moment, the morning light coming through their kitchen window, the sound of her chewing, the way she hummed a little between bites. These were the things that mattered, he reminded himself. Not the interview, not the job, just this. But the stack of bills on the counter said otherwise. An hour later, Evan stood in front of the bathroom mirror in the only suit he owned, straightening a tie that had seen better days. The suit was navy, purchased 6 years ago for a wedding neither he nor Claire had particularly wanted to attend, and it hung slightly loose on his frame now. He'd lost weight over the past 2 years, not from intention, but from the kind of stress that burned through calories like fuel. His reflection looked tired. Professional, he hoped, but tired. "You look really handsome, Dad," Lily said from the doorway, already wearing her jacket. Evan turned to her, managed a smile. "Thank you, sweetheart. You ready?" They walked down 3 flights of stairs together, Evan carrying both their bags, and emerged onto a street that was just beginning to wake up. The neighborhood wasn't dangerous exactly, but it wasn't the kind of place Evan had imagined raising his daughter. The building needed paint, the sidewalks needed repair, but the rent was manageable, and their neighbors were kind, and sometimes that was enough. Mrs. Patterson was waiting by her car, an older woman with gray hair and a warm smile who'd taken it upon herself to help Evan however she could. She waved when she saw them. "There's my girl," she called, and Lily ran ahead, suddenly 8 years old again instead of the little adult she sometimes tried to be. "Thank you for this," Evan said when he reached the car, helping Lily with her seatbelt. "Really? I don't know what I'd do without you." "Nonsense," Mrs. Patterson said firmly. "You'd figure it out. You always do. Now go get that job and stop worrying. Lily and I will have a wonderful day." Evan kissed the top of his daughter's head, breathed in the strawberry scent of her shampoo. "Be good. I love you." "Love you too, Dad. You've got this." He watched them drive away, Lily's hand waving from the back window, and then turned toward the bus stop. The Meridian building was downtown, in the part of the city where the architecture turned sleek and glass and modern. Evan had looked it up online. 27 stories, all sharp angles and reflective surfaces, the kind of place that seemed designed to make you feel small. The bus ride took 40 minutes. Evan spent it reviewing his notes, the questions he'd prepared answers for, the stories he'd chosen to highlight his experience. He'd worked in nonprofit administration for 6 years before Claire got sick, had managed community partnerships and grant programs and volunteer networks. He was good at what he did. He just needed someone to give him the chance to prove it again. The Meridian building was even more intimidating in person. Evan stood on the sidewalk outside, looking up at all that glass and steel, and felt something very much like fear settle in his stomach. But he thought of Lily's confidence, Mrs. Patterson's kindness, the bills on his counter, and pushed through the revolving door into the lobby. Security, sign-in sheet, visitor badge, elevator to the 19th floor. The reception area was all clean lines and expensive furniture, the kind of space that whispered rather than spoke. A young woman at the desk smiled professionally and asked him to wait. Evan sat in one of the impossibly comfortable chairs, set his worn briefcase on the floor beside him, and tried not to think about how out of place he looked. Other people moved through the space, men and women in perfect suits, carrying leather portfolios, speaking in the confident tones of people who belonged. Evan watched them and wondered if he'd ever sound like that again, if he'd ever move through the world with that kind of certainty. "Mr. Brooks?" He looked up to find a woman standing before him, mid-40s perhaps, with dark hair pulled back and sharp, intelligent eyes. She wore a gray suit that probably cost more than Evan's entire wardrobe, but her smile was genuine. "I'm Victoria Hale, Vice President of Community Relations. Thank you for coming in today." Evan stood, shook her hand, tried to project confidence he didn't entirely feel. "Thank you for the opportunity. Please, follow me." She led him through a maze of corridors, past offices with glass walls where people worked at enormous monitors, past conference rooms where meetings were already in progress. They ended in a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the entire city. The view was staggering. "Have a seat," Victoria said, gesturing to a chair across from her desk. "Can I get you anything? Coffee? Water?" "I'm fine, thank you." She settled into her own chair, opened a folder that Evan recognized as his application materials. "I've reviewed your resume several times, Mr. Brooks. Your background is impressive. 6 years with Community Partners Alliance, successful grant management, strong relationships with local organizations. You clearly know this work." "I do," Evan said, finding his voice. "Community outreach has always been more than a job to me. It's about connection, about understanding what people actually need instead of what we think they need." Victoria nodded, making a note. "Tell me about your approach to building those partnerships. How do you establish trust with community leaders?" And just like that, Evan was talking. The nervousness didn't disappear entirely, but it faded into the background as he spoke about the work he'd loved, the projects he'd led, the difference he'd seen when organizations actually listened to the people they claimed to serve. Victoria asked thoughtful questions, pushing him to elaborate, to provide specific examples. He told her about the youth mentorship program he'd developed, the way they'd partnered with local schools instead of trying to operate independently. He described the community garden initiative that had started with 12 volunteers and grown into something that fed 200 families. "That's exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need," Victoria said, and Evan felt a flutter of hope in his chest. "Our foundation has significant resources, but we've struggled to connect authentically with the communities we're trying to support. Someone with your experience could be transformative for us." They talked for another 20 minutes about program development, about budget management, about measuring impact in meaningful ways. Evan found himself relaxing, speaking with the confidence that came from genuine knowledge and experience. This was who he'd been, before grief and exhaustion had stripped away so much of himself. This was the work that made him feel purposeful. Then Victoria glanced down at his resume again, and her expression shifted slightly. "I do need to ask about this gap," she said, her tone still professional, but gentler now. "You left Community Partners Alliance 2 years ago, and there's no employment listed since then. Can you walk me through that?" Evan had known this question was coming. He'd prepared for it, practiced his answer in the mirror, tried to find words that were honest without being overwhelming. But now, sitting in this perfect office with this woman who might hold his family's future in her hands, all his careful preparation seemed to evaporate. "My wife got sick," he said simply. "Pancreatic cancer. Stage 4 by the time they found it." Victoria's expression softened immediately. "I'm so sorry." "Thank you." Evan took a breath, steadied himself. "She lived for 11 months after diagnosis. I took a leave of absence to be with her, to help manage her care, and to be there for our daughter. After Claire passed, I needed time. Lily needed time. She was 6 years old and her whole world had changed, and I couldn't just go back to work and pretend everything was normal." "Of course not," Victoria said quietly. "That must have been incredibly difficult." "It was. It still is." Evan met her eyes, willing her to understand. "But I'm ready to work again." "More than ready. My daughter is in school full-time now. We have good childcare arrangements in place, and I need—" He stopped himself, realizing how desperate he sounded. "I'm ready to contribute again, to do work that matters." Victoria nodded slowly, and Evan couldn't read her expression. Was she sympathetic? Concerned about his reliability? Worried that he'd need time off for his daughter? He'd heard all the unspoken concerns before, seen them in the faces of other interviewers who'd thanked him for his time and then never called back. "What are your childcare arrangements?" Victoria asked. And there it was, the question that every hiring manager wanted answered, but few actually asked directly. "My daughter is in 3rd grade, Evan explained, trying to sound organized and capable. "School is 8 a.m. to 3 p.m. I have an arrangement with a neighbor who can handle drop-off on mornings I need to be in early, and I've identified an after-school program that can cover until 6 p.m. if needed. For sick days or emergencies, I have backup options through—" His phone vibrated in his pocket. Evan ignored it, kept talking. "Through our building's informal support network, several retired neighbors who've offered to help when—" The phone vibrated again. And again. "I apologize," Evan said, heat rising in his face. "I thought I'd silenced it. Where was I? The after-school program covers until 6 p.m., which gives me flexibility for—" 3 more vibrations in rapid succession. Victoria's expression was polite, professional, but Evan saw something flicker in her eyes. This was it, he thought. This was the moment she'd decided he was unreliable, that hiring a single father was too much risk, too much complication. "I'm sorry," he said again, pulling out the phone to silence it properly. "This won't—" And then he saw the screen. 5 missed calls from Washington Elementary School. 3 from Mrs. Patterson. A text message preview that made his heart stop. Lily had an accident on the playground. Possible broken. He didn't read the rest. Didn't think. Didn't calculate the cost or consequence. Evan stood up, his chair scraping against the expensive floor. "I have to go," he said, the words coming from somewhere beyond conscious thought. "I'm sorry, I have to go right now." Victoria blinked at him, surprise breaking through her professional composure. "Mr. Brooks." But Evan was already moving toward the door, his phone pressed to his ear, dialing the school. It rang once, twice. He was in the corridor now, walking fast, nearly running. "Washington Elementary, this is Donna." "This is Evan Brooks," he said, his voice tight with controlled panic. "You called about my daughter, Lily Brooks. What happened? Is she okay?" "Mr. Brooks, please don't panic," the secretary said quickly. "Lily fell from the monkey bars during recess. She's hurt her arm, and we think it might be broken. We've called an ambulance to be safe. Which hospital?" Evan was at the elevators now, jabbing the button repeatedly. "Where are they taking her?" "Mercy General. Mr. Brooks, she's conscious and alert, but she's in pain and she's asking for you. The elevator doors opened. Evan stepped inside, barely registered that he wasn't alone. I'm on my way, he said. Tell her I'm on my way. 20 minutes. Tell her Daddy's coming. He ended the call, pressed the lobby button, and only then realized that Victoria Hale was standing beside him in the elevator, her professional facade completely abandoned. Is your daughter all right? She asked, her voice sharp with concern. I don't know, Evan said, and his voice cracked on the words. She fell. Broke her arm, maybe. They're taking her to Mercy General. I'm sorry about the interview. I have to go. The elevator descended in silence for 3 floors. Then Victoria spoke again. Which hospital? Mercy General. I'll take the bus. The bus will take 45 minutes, Victoria said flatly. My car is in the garage. Come on. Evan stared at her. You don't have to. Your daughter is hurt and frightened and asking for you, Victoria said, her tone leaving no room for argument. We're not debating this. Come on. The elevator reached the lobby. Victoria strode out with the kind of authority that made people move out of her way instinctively. Evan followed, his mind spinning, trying to process what was happening. He'd walked out of a job interview. He'd probably just destroyed his last real chance at employment, and now his interviewer was driving him to the hospital. Wait, he said suddenly, stopping in the middle of the lobby. My briefcase. I left it in your office. Victoria didn't break stride. We'll get it later. Your daughter needs you now. They descended into the underground parking garage, their footsteps echoing in the concrete space. Victoria's car was a sleek black sedan, expensive but not ostentatious. She unlocked it, slid into the driver's seat with practiced ease. Seatbelt, she said as Evan dropped into the passenger seat, and tell me the fastest route. As they pulled out onto the street, Evan tried to call Mrs. Patterson. It went to voicemail. He tried the school again, got the same secretary. She's in the ambulance now, Donna told him. The paramedic said she's stable. Frightened, but stable. Thank you, Evan managed. Please tell anyone who's with her that I'm 10 minutes away. Victoria drove with focused intensity, weaving through traffic with the confidence of someone who knew these streets intimately. She didn't speak, didn't ask questions, just drove. Evan sat beside her, his hands gripping his knees, trying to breathe, trying not to imagine Lily alone and scared in an ambulance. She's going to be okay, Victoria said suddenly, her eyes still on the road. Kids break bones all the time. It's terrifying, but she's going to be fine. She's all I have, Evan said, the words emerging without permission. If something happened to her, if I wasn't there when she needed me, you'll be there, Victoria said firmly. We're 5 minutes away. True to her word, they pulled into the Mercy General emergency entrance exactly 5 minutes later. Evan was out of the car before it fully stopped, running toward the doors. The ER was chaos, crying children, worried parents, the smell of antiseptic and fear. He found the registration desk, gave his daughter's name, and was directed to a curtained area in the back. Daddy! The sound of Lily's voice, scared but present, nearly broke him. Evan pushed through the curtain and found her on a hospital bed, her left arm cradled against her chest, her face tear-stained but trying to be brave. A paramedic stood beside her, taking notes. Hey, baby girl, Evan said, his voice somehow steady as he reached her side. I'm here. I'm right here. It hurts, Lily said, and then she started crying in earnest, the brave facade crumbling now that her father was present. I fell and it hurt so much. I know, sweetheart, I know. Evan looked at the paramedic, a young woman with kind eyes. How bad is it? Looks like a clean break of the radius, she said. Painful, but straightforward. The doctor will be in shortly to examine her, and we'll get x-rays to confirm. She's been very brave. Lily was still crying, her right hand reaching for Evan. He took it, squeezed gently, and she held on like he was the only solid thing in the world. You're okay, he told her softly. You're going to be absolutely okay, I promise. You came really fast, Lily said through her tears. You must have been close. Before Evan could answer, the curtain moved again, and Victoria stepped through. She'd clearly charmed or convinced or simply commanded her way past the ER's security protocols. She took in the scene, Lily crying, Evan holding her hand, the sterile equipment surrounding them. and her expression softened in a way that seemed entirely unguarded. "This must be Lily," she said, moving closer. "Hi, Lily. My name is Victoria. Your dad and I were having a meeting when we heard you got hurt, and he insisted I drive him here because he absolutely could not wait one more second to see you." Lily looked at this strange, elegant woman with confused, tear-filled eyes. "Were you at his interview?" "I was," Victoria said, crouching down beside the bed so she was at eye level with the child. "And I have to tell you, I've never seen anyone move as fast as your dad did when he found out you were hurt. He didn't even wait for the elevator. I think he would have jumped out the window if it was faster." Despite her pain, Lily managed a watery laugh. "Dad wouldn't jump out a window." "For you?" Victoria smiled. "I think he absolutely would." A doctor appeared then, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and capable hands. He examined Lily's arm with gentle efficiency, explaining what he was doing in simple terms. Yes, it was broken. Yes, they'd need x-rays. Yes, it would need a cast. No, she couldn't have a pink cast because they were out of pink, but they had purple and blue and green. Purple, Lily decided, her tears subsiding now. Definitely purple. "Good choice," the doctor said. "Now, we're going to take you for x-rays. It won't hurt, but you'll need to hold very still. Can you do that?" Lily nodded, looking at her father for reassurance. "I'll be right here," Evan promised, the entire time. They wheeled her away and Evan followed, Victoria trailing behind them. The x-ray process was quick but felt eternal. Lily tried so hard to be brave, biting her lip against the pain when they had to position her arm. Evan stood where she could see him through the window, keeping his expression calm and confident, even though his heart was racing. When they wheeled Lily back to the curtained area, the doctor reviewed the images with them. "Clean break like we thought," he said. "No displacement, no complications. We'll set it, cast it, and she'll be good as new in 6 to 8 weeks. Kids heal fast." "Thank God," Evan breathed. The setting process was the worst part. Even with pain medication, Lily cried, and Evan had to hold her shoulders while the doctor and nurse worked. Victoria stood in the corner, her arms crossed, her jaw tight. When it was over and they were wrapping the purple cast, she stepped outside the curtain. Evan heard her talking quietly to someone, probably hospital staff, but he was focused entirely on his daughter. "Look at that," he said, forcing cheerfulness into his voice as they finished the cast. "That's the coolest purple I've ever seen. You're going to be the talk of the school." "Will you sign it?" Lily asked, her voice small. "I'll be the first one," Evan promised, "and we'll get all your friends to sign it too." When the cast was done and the discharge paperwork was being prepared, Victoria returned with a small stuffed bear wearing a hospital gown. "The gift shop was having a sale," she said, offering it to Lily. "I thought you might want a patient buddy, someone who understands what you're going through." Lily took the bear, hugged it carefully with her good arm. "Thank you," she said shyly. "What's your name again?" "Victoria, but you can call me Vic if you want." "Thank you, Vic." The hospital processed them out with the kind of efficiency that suggested they'd done this thousands of times before. Instructions for care, prescription for pain medication if needed, follow-up appointment card. Evan listened to all of it, asked the right questions, signed the forms. Victoria stood nearby, silent but present. When they finally walked out into the afternoon sunlight, Evan felt the adrenaline begin to drain from his body, leaving behind bone-deep exhaustion. Lily leaned against him, her purple cast bright against her shirt, the stuffed bear tucked under her good arm. "My car's this way," Victoria said quietly. "I'll take you both home." "You don't have to—" "Evan," she used his first name for the first time. "Let me drive you home." So he did. He gave her their address, and she drove through the city without comment when they entered the neighborhood that was so clearly different from where they'd started that morning. She pulled up in front of his building, put the car in park, and turned to face him. "Thank you," Evan said, and the words felt impossibly inadequate. "For everything. For driving me, for staying, for... I don't even know how to thank you properly." "You don't need to thank me," Victoria said. "Any decent person would have done the same thing." "But most people wouldn't have," Evan said quietly. "Most people would have let me figure it out on my own and written me off as unreliable." Victoria was quiet for a moment, her hand still on the steering wheel. Can I tell you something, Evan? When you stood up in that interview and said you had to go, no hesitation, no calculation, just immediate action, that told me more about who you are than any answer you could have given to my questions. Evan shook his head. It told you I walked out on a job interview. It told me you're a father who knows what matters most, Victoria corrected. And that's not a weakness. That's exactly the kind of integrity we need at Meridian. Evan stared at her, not daring to believe what he was hearing. What are you saying? I'm saying the job is yours if you want it, Victoria said simply. Standard offer package, salary, benefits, 2 weeks paid vacation to start. You can begin as soon as you're ready. Monday, if that works, though I imagine you'll want to stay home with Lily for a few days while she adjusts to the cast. Evan's voice failed him. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious. Victoria pulled a business card from her purse, wrote something on the back, and handed it to him. That's my personal cell phone. Call me this weekend and we'll finalize the details. But Evan, the job is yours. You already proved you're exactly who we need. Lily stirred against him, tired from pain and medication. Dad, can we go home now? Yeah, baby, Evan said, his voice thick. Let's go home. He helped Lily out of the car, gathered her carefully into his arms. Victoria rolled down the window. Take care of her, she said. And take care of yourself. I'll talk to you this weekend. Evan watched her drive away. This woman who'd turned what should have been his worst professional moment into something he couldn't quite name yet. Hope, maybe. Or possibility. Or just the simple kindness of being seen as a whole person instead of a risk assessment. Dad? Lily said against his shoulder. Did you get the job? Yeah, Lil, Evan said, carrying her toward their building, toward their small apartment with its peeling paint and careful budget and enormous love. I think I did. And for the first time in 2 years, Evan Brooks felt like the world might actually be working with him instead of against him. Not because everything was suddenly perfect, but because someone had looked at his life, at the gaps and the grief and the unconventional choices, and seen strength instead of weakness. He'd walked away from that interview certain he'd destroyed everything. Instead, he'd found someone who understood that being a good father wasn't a liability. It was the most important qualification he could possibly have. Mrs. Patterson was waiting on the building's front steps when Evan carried Lily up the walkway, her face creased with worry that smoothed only slightly when she saw them both safe. She'd been calling the hospital, she explained, but they wouldn't give her information since she wasn't family. She'd been frantic, imagining the worst, and now she fussed over Lily's purple cast with the kind of attention that spoke to genuine affection rather than mere neighborly duty. I'm so sorry I wasn't there faster, Mrs. Patterson said, touching the cast gently. The school called me right after they called you, but by the time I got there, the ambulance had already left. It's not your fault, Evan assured her, shifting Lily's weight in his arms. You did everything right. I'm just grateful you were there at all. Who was that woman who drove you? Mrs. Patterson asked, her curiosity poorly disguised. She didn't look like anyone from around here. That was Victoria, Lily said sleepily. She gave me this bear and she said Dad would jump out a window for me. Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows rose, looking at Evan for explanation. My interviewer, Evan said simply. She drove me to the hospital when she heard about Lily, and then she gave me the job anyway. She gave you the job? Mrs. Patterson's hand flew to her chest. Oh, Evan, that's wonderful. This is the best news. Can we celebrate later? Lily asked, her voice small. My arm hurts and I'm really tired. They said goodbye to Mrs. Patterson with promises to update her soon, and Evan carried Lily up the 3 flights of stairs to their apartment. She felt heavier than usual in his arms, or maybe he was just exhausted, running on the dregs of adrenaline that had been burning since that first phone call. He unlocked their door, kicked it shut behind them, and settled Lily carefully on the couch. Do you want the pain medicine? He asked, checking the prescription bag the hospital had sent home with them. Not yet, Lily said. It makes me feel weird. Can I just have juice? Evan got her apple juice in her favorite cup, the one with the faded cartoon characters that she was probably getting too old for but refused to abandon. He propped pillows around her, turned on the television to her preferred channel, and sat beside her on the couch. The afternoon stretched before them, uncertain and strange. He should probably call the school, let them know Lily was home and okay. He should probably think about dinner. He should probably process what had happened. Walking out of an interview, the desperate drive to the hospital, Victoria's incomprehensible kindness, the job offer that seemed too good to be real. Instead, he just sat with his daughter and let her rest against his shoulder, her purple cast bright in the dim light of their living room. "Dad?" Lily said after a while. "Are you mad at me?" Evan looked down at her, startled. "What? No, why would I be mad at you?" "Because I ruined your interview," Lily said, not meeting his eyes. "You said it was really important, and then I fell and you had to leave, and I thought maybe you'd be mad." Something cracked open in Evan's chest. He shifted so he could look at her properly, so she could see his face when he spoke. "Lily, listen to me," he said firmly. "You did not ruin anything. You got hurt, and I came to help you, and that is exactly what I'm supposed to do. That is literally my job as your dad. Do you understand?" "But the interview doesn't matter," Evan said. "Not compared to you. Nothing matters compared to you." "But you got the job anyway," Lily pointed out, her logic still functioning despite pain and exhaustion. "So maybe it does matter a little." Evan couldn't help but laugh. "You're right. I did get the job. But that's because Victoria understood that being your dad is more important than any meeting. She understood that I made the right choice." Lily considered this, her young face serious. "Is that why she drove you? Because she thought you did the right thing?" "I think so, yeah." "Then I like her," Lily decided. "She seems nice, and she has a really cool car." They spent the rest of the afternoon in comfortable quiet, Lily dozing on and off while Evan sat beside her and tried to process the day. Around 5 o'clock, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "It's Victoria," the message read. "Just wanted to check that you both made it home safely. How is Lily feeling?" Evan stared at the message for a long moment. His interviewer, his now boss, he supposed, was checking on his daughter. This wasn't protocol or professional courtesy. This was genuine concern from someone who'd spent her afternoon in an emergency room instead of conducting business as usual. "We're home," he typed back. "Lily's resting, still in some pain but managing. Thank you again for everything today. I still can't quite believe it happened." The response came quickly. "Believe it, and please don't come in Monday. Take the week to help Lily adjust to the cast. We'll plan for you to start the following Monday instead. Full pay begins immediately. I'll have HR send the paperwork." Evan read the message 3 times, making sure he understood correctly. Full pay starting immediately, even though he wouldn't actually begin work for over a week. That was money they desperately needed, arriving exactly when they needed it most. "Thank you," he wrote back. "I don't know what else to say except thank you." "You already said everything that mattered when you stood up in that interview," Victoria replied. "Get some rest. Both of you." When Lily woke up an hour later, the pain had intensified enough that she agreed to take the medication. Evan measured it carefully, gave it to her with more juice, and then faced the question of dinner. Their refrigerator was sparse. He'd been planning to shop after the interview, expecting either to celebrate or to drown his sorrows in the routine of grocery shopping. Now those plans seemed to belong to a different lifetime. "How about I order pizza?" he suggested. "We can call it a celebration dinner." "Can we afford pizza?" Lily asked, and the question, so practical, so aware of their limitations, hurt more than Evan wanted to admit. "Yes," he said firmly. "We can definitely afford pizza tonight." He ordered from the cheap place down the street, got Lily's favorite toppings, and splurged on breadsticks because why not? While they waited for delivery, Lily asked him to tell her about the job, about what he'd be doing, about whether he'd have to wear a suit every day. "I'll be managing community outreach programs," Evan explained, "helping the foundation connect with neighborhoods and organizations that need support. It's basically what I used to do before your mom got sick." "Do you think you'll be good at it?" Lily asked. "I think so. I hope so. I think you'll be great," Lily said with the absolute confidence that only children possess. "You're good at helping people." You help me all the time. The pizza arrived, and they ate it on the couch with paper plates and too many napkins, watching a movie that Lily had seen a dozen times before but never seemed to tire of. The medication made her drowsy, and she fell asleep before the movie ended, her head in Evan's lap, her purple cast resting carefully on a pillow. Evan sat there long after the credits rolled, one hand resting lightly on his daughter's hair, trying to understand how a day that had started with oatmeal and anxiety had transformed into something he couldn't quite name yet. The weekend passed in a strange suspension of time. Lily's cast became the center of their small universe, learning how to keep it dry during baths, figuring out comfortable sleeping positions, managing pain medication and itching, and the general frustration of limited mobility. Friends from school sent get-well messages that Mrs. Patterson delivered. The teacher called to check in and arrange for homework to be sent home. Life continued, adapted, found new patterns. On Saturday afternoon, Evan called the number Victoria had written on the back of her business card. She answered on the second ring. "Evan, how are you both doing?" "Better," he said. "Lily's adapting faster than I expected. Kids are resilient." "They really are." There was something in Victoria's voice, some depth of understanding that suggested personal experience. "Listen, I wanted to talk through some details about your position. Do you have a few minutes?" They discussed salary, more than Evan had dared hope for, benefits, comprehensive health insurance that made him want to cry with relief. Start date, 2 weeks from Monday, giving him time to ensure Lily was settled. Victoria was professional but warm, answering his questions with patience, explaining the foundation structure and his place within it. "You'll be working directly with me," she said, "which means you'll have some flexibility in your schedule. I know you have a daughter who needs you, and I'm not interested in pretending that doesn't exist. We'll make it work." "I appreciate that more than you know," Evan said quietly. "I do know, actually." Victoria paused, and when she spoke again, her voice had shifted into something more personal. "Can I tell you something, Evan? Something not particularly professional?" "Of course." 20 years ago, I was a single mother working 3 jobs to keep my son fed and housed, Victoria said. His father wasn't in the picture. My family had written me off, and I was drowning. I'd managed to finish college by taking night classes and sleeping about 4 hours a night, but I had no professional experience, no network, no opportunities that weren't minimum wage retail or food service. Evan listened, surprised by this glimpse into his boss's past. "I applied for an entry-level position at a corporate foundation, something I was wildly underqualified for," Victoria continued. "Got an interview somehow. Showed up in a suit from Goodwill, prepared answers to questions I'd researched in the library because I couldn't afford internet at home. And I was doing okay, I think, until my babysitter called mid-interview to say my son had a fever of 103 and she was taking him to urgent care." "What did you do?" Evan asked, though he thought he knew the answer. "I stood up and left," Victoria said simply. "Just like you did. And the woman interviewing me, her name was Margaret Chen, she drove me to urgent care, stayed with me while they examined my son, gave me the job anyway. She said any mother who would walk out on an interview to care for a sick child was exactly the kind of person she wanted working for her foundation." "That's incredible," Evan said. "That's why I drove you to the hospital," Victoria said, "because Margaret taught me that the measure of a person isn't how well they perform when everything is easy. It's what they choose when the choice is hard. You chose your daughter without hesitation. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." Evan found himself blinking back tears in his quiet apartment. "What happened to Margaret?" "She became my mentor, my friend, and eventually the reason I have the career I have today," Victoria said. "She passed away 3 years ago, but I think about her every single day, about how one act of kindness changed my entire life trajectory. I'm so sorry for your loss." "Thank you, but my point is this. I'm not being kind to you out of charity, Evan. I'm giving you this job because you're qualified, and because you demonstrated the exact values our foundation claims to represent. Integrity, community, putting people first. You lived those values in that interview room, even though it cost you everything you thought you needed." "Except it didn't cost me anything," Evan said, "because you were there." "This time, yes, but you didn't know that when you made the choice. That's what matters." They talked for a few more minutes about logistics and schedules, and then Victoria let him go with instructions to enjoy the weekend and not worry about work until his start date. Evan ended the call and sat in the silence of his living room, trying to process this revelation about his new boss. She'd been where he was. She understood not just intellectually, but viscerally what it meant to be a single parent fighting for stability. And she'd made it. She'd survived and succeeded and become the kind of person who could offer that same lifeline to someone else. On Sunday morning, Lily's friends from school came to visit. A small parade of 8-year-olds bearing markers and stickers and determined to make her purple cast the most decorated one in history. Evan supervised from the kitchen, making snacks and listening to their chatter, grateful for the normalcy of children's laughter in their apartment. By the time the friends left, Lily's cast was covered in drawings and signatures and messages of support, and her spirits had lifted considerably. "I kind of like having a broken arm," she admitted that evening as Evan helped her get ready for bed. "Everyone's being really nice to me." "People are usually nice when you're hurt," Evan said, helping her into pajamas that accommodated the cast. "But I hope you don't make a habit of breaking bones just to test that theory." "I won't," Lily promised. "It hurt too much." "But Dad, I'm really glad you got the job. Does this mean we don't have to worry so much about money anymore?" Evan tucked her into bed, smoothed her hair back from her forehead. "We'll still have to be careful," he said honestly. "But yeah, baby, we won't have to worry quite so much." "Good," Lily said, her eyes already closing. "I didn't like it when you looked so worried all the time. You look happier now." "I feel happier," Evan said softly. "Get some sleep, okay?" Monday morning arrived with the strange quality of a day that should have been momentous but was instead ordinary. Evan didn't have to go to work. He didn't have to put on his worn suit and pretend confidence he didn't feel. Instead, he made breakfast with Lily, helped her practice writing with her non-dominant hand in preparation for school, and felt the unfamiliar sensation of breathing without constant anxiety compressing his chest. Around 10 o'clock, his email chimed with a message from Meridian Foundation's Human Resources Department. The employment contract was attached, pages of legal language that Evan read carefully, looking for catches or caveats that might suggest this was too good to be true. But there was nothing suspicious, nothing problematic, just a straightforward offer of employment with a salary that would allow them to live with dignity, benefits that would protect them if Lily got sick or hurt again, and language about work-life balance that seemed almost too generous to believe. He signed the contract electronically, sent it back, and then sat at his kitchen table trying to absorb the reality that his life had fundamentally changed in the span of 3 days. His phone rang. Victoria. "Did you get the contract?" she asked without preamble. "Just signed it and sent it back." "Good. I have a question for you, and I want you to answer honestly. Are you comfortable with public speaking?" Evan considered this. "I used to be." "Why?" "Because I'm giving a presentation to the board next month about our community outreach initiatives, and I'd like you to be part of it," Victoria said. "Nothing major, just a brief introduction and maybe some thoughts on your approach to community partnership. But if that makes you uncomfortable, we can find another way." "No, that sounds good," Evan said, surprising himself. "I'd like to be involved." "Excellent. We'll schedule some prep time before your start date. I want you to feel confident going in." They talked through a few more details, and then Victoria asked casually, "How's Lily doing with the cast?" "She's adapting. Her friends came over yesterday and turned it into an art project." Victoria laughed. "Kids are amazing that way. My son broke his leg when he was 10, and by the time the cast came off, you couldn't even see the plaster anymore under all the signatures and drawings." "You have a son?" "I do. He's 28 now, working as a civil engineer in Seattle. Calls me every Sunday without fail." There was obvious pride in her voice. "Being a single parent was the hardest thing I've ever done, but he turned out pretty wonderfully despite all my mistakes." "I'm sure you made fewer mistakes than you think," Evan said. "Maybe. Or maybe I just got lucky with a kid who was resilient enough to survive them." Victoria's tone shifted back to business. "Listen, I need to go into a meeting. But Evan, I'm really glad you're joining the team. I think you're going to do exceptional work." "Thank you for everything." "Thank me by being as good at this job as I know you can be," Victoria said. "That's all I ask." The rest of the week passed in a blur of adjustment. Lily returned to school on Tuesday with her decorated cast and a detailed story about her fall that grew more dramatic with each retelling. Evan spent his days preparing for his new position, researching the Foundation's past projects, reading reports, familiarizing himself with the programs he'd be managing. He felt rusty, his professional brain emerging from 2 years of dormancy, but the work felt good. It felt purposeful in a way that nothing had since Claire died. On Thursday afternoon, a package arrived at their apartment. Large, professionally wrapped, addressed to Lily Brooks. She opened it carefully with Evan's help, revealing a collection of books, middle-grade novels about brave girls and magical adventures, and a note written in elegant handwriting. "Dear Lily," the note read, "I heard you're an excellent reader, so I thought you might enjoy these while you're recovering. They're some of my son's favorites from when he was your age. I hope your arm feels better soon. Best wishes, Victoria." Lily looked up at Evan with wide eyes. "Your boss sent me books?" "Apparently she did. That's really nice." Lily examined the books, reading the back covers with the serious attention she gave to all literary decisions. "Can you tell her thank you?" Evan texted Victoria that evening, thanking her for the unexpected gift. Her response came quickly. "Every kid deserves good books. Enjoy." The weekend before his start date, Evan took Lily to the park near their apartment. She couldn't play on the equipment with her cast, but they walked the paths together, watching other children run and climb and laugh. It was a beautiful afternoon, warm with the promise of spring, and Lily chattered happily about school and her friends and the science project she was planning. "Dad?" she said as they sat on a bench together, sharing a pretzel from the vendor near the entrance. "Are you nervous about starting your job?" "A little," Evan admitted. "It's been a long time since I worked in an office." "But you're really good at it, right? That's why Victoria hired you?" "I hope that's why." "It is," Lily said with certainty. "And besides, if you need help, you can always ask Victoria. She seems like someone who helps people." Out of the mouths of children, Evan thought. His 8-year-old daughter had immediately recognized what had taken him much longer to see, that Victoria Hale was someone who understood the value of extending a hand to those who needed it. Not out of pity or obligation, but from genuine belief that everyone deserved a chance to succeed. Monday morning arrived with the weight of new beginnings. Evan woke early, showered, put on his navy suit that didn't hang quite so loose anymore after a week of reduced stress and regular meals. He made Lily breakfast, helped her get ready for school, and felt the familiar anxiety that came with first days. "You look very professional," Lily told him seriously as Mrs. Patterson knocked on their door to take her to school. "You're going to do great." "Thanks, baby. Be good at school." I'm always good," Lily said, kissing his cheek before heading out with Mrs. Patterson. Evan stood in his empty apartment for a moment, breathing deeply, and then headed out to catch the bus downtown. The city looked different this morning, less intimidating and more full of possibility. The Meridian building still gleamed with wealth and power, but when Evan walked through the lobby, he felt like he belonged there. Security recognized him this time, his badge already prepared and waiting. The elevator took him to the 19th floor, where a young woman from HR met him with a warm smile and a folder full of orientation materials. She walked him through the building, introducing him to staff members whose names he tried desperately to remember, showing him his office. His actual office, with a door and a window and a desk that was larger than his kitchen table at home. "Victoria asked that you stop by her office when you're settled," the HR representative said. "She's in meetings all morning, but she wanted to see you before lunch." Evan spent the morning getting oriented, setting up his computer, reviewing files and project documents. It felt surreal, sitting in this professional space, doing work that mattered. Around 11:30, he walked down the hall to Victoria's office, knocked gently on her open door. She looked up from her computer, smiled genuinely. "Evan, come in. How's the first morning going?" "Good. Overwhelming, but good." "That's normal. You'll find your rhythm quickly." Victoria gestured to the chair across from her desk. "I wanted to check in, see if you need anything." "I think I'm okay," Evan said. "Everyone's been very welcoming." "Good. I also wanted to give you this." She slid a folder across the desk. "It's information about our emergency childcare benefit. If Lily gets sick or school closes unexpectedly, the Foundation has a partnership with a backup care service. You'll have access to vetted caregivers at no cost for up to 10 days per year. Evan stared at the folder. Emotion suddenly thick in his throat. I didn't know that existed. Most employees don't use it, but for those who need it, it's invaluable, Victoria said. I made sure it was part of our benefits package 10 years ago, based on my own experience. Just knowing it's there can reduce a lot of stress. Thank you, Evan managed. Thank you. Victoria's expression softened. You're going to be great at this job, Evan. I have complete confidence in that. But I also know that being a single parent means your life is more complicated than most people's. I'm not interested in pretending otherwise. We'll figure it out together as we go. And Evan realized, sitting in that office, looking at this woman who'd turned what should have been disaster into opportunity, that he'd found more than employment. He'd found someone who understood that strength wasn't pretending your life was simple. It was showing up and doing your best while acknowledging that sometimes your best looked different from everyone else's. That walking out of an interview to care for your child wasn't weakness or unprofessionalism. It was exactly the kind of courage that mattered most. The first month at Meridian Foundation moved with the peculiar rhythm of new beginnings, half exhilaration, half terror, all consuming. Evan threw himself into the work with an intensity that surprised even him, driven by equal parts gratitude and determination to prove Victoria's faith in him wasn't misplaced. He reviewed years of community partnership reports, studied the Foundation's grant-making history, and identified patterns that suggested opportunities for deeper impact. The work was challenging in the best possible way, demanding both analytical rigor and creative thinking. And Evan discovered that his professional self hadn't disappeared during those 2 years of grief and survival. It had just been waiting. His colleagues were welcoming but curious, clearly wondering about this man who'd appeared seemingly from nowhere to work directly under Victoria Hale. Evan caught whispered conversations that stopped when he entered break rooms, saw the speculative glances when Victoria called him into her office for strategy sessions. But he kept his head down, focused on proving himself through competence rather than explanation. Let them wonder. He had work to do. Victoria herself was exactly the kind of boss Evan had hoped for but never quite believed existed. Demanding but supportive, direct but kind, willing to give him both autonomy and guidance depending on what each situation required. She trusted him to manage his own schedule, which meant he could leave at 3 o'clock to pick up Lily from school and then finish work in the evenings after she went to bed. She included him in high-level meetings where he mostly listened and learned, absorbing the language and culture of Foundation work at this scale. And she never once made him feel like he needed to apologize for his life's complications. 3 weeks into his new position, Victoria called him into her office just before 5 o'clock. The late afternoon sun slanted through her windows, turning the city below into something golden and almost beautiful. She had papers spread across her desk, the kind of organized chaos that suggested deep concentration. I've been reviewing the community partnership portfolio, she said without preamble, and I think we're failing at something fundamental. Evan sat down, his attention immediately focused. What do you mean? We're giving money to the right organizations, supporting good programs, checking all the boxes, Victoria said, leaning back in her chair. But we're not actually connecting with the communities we claim to serve. We're operating from up here. She gestured around her office. Making decisions about neighborhoods we've never spent time in, problems we've never personally experienced. We're well-intentioned outsiders. And that's not good enough. I've noticed that too, Evan admitted. The reports are all very professional, very polished, but they feel distant, like they're about statistics instead of people. Exactly. Victoria pulled out a specific file, slid it across the desk. Take the Riverside Youth Initiative. We've funded them for 5 years. Excellent outcomes on paper. But when's the last time anyone from this office actually went to Riverside, talked to the kids in the program, spent time understanding what's actually happening on the ground? Evan flipped through the file, seeing the kind of quarterly reports he'd written himself in his previous job, full of data and metrics, light on narrative or context. Probably never, he said quietly. That's what I want you to change, Victoria said, her voice carrying the weight of real authority now. I want you to redesign how we approach community partnership. Not from here, not from reports and meetings and grant applications, but from the ground up. I want you to go into these neighborhoods, meet with the people doing the work, understand what they actually need versus what we think they need. The scope of what she was proposing began to sink in. That's a significant shift in approach. It is, which is why it needs someone who understands what it's like to be on the other side of these systems, Victoria said, meeting his eyes directly. Someone who knows what it feels like to need help and to be frustrated by people who want to help but don't understand what help actually looks like. That's you, Evan. I appreciate the confidence, Evan said carefully. But I've only been here 3 weeks. This feels like something that would take months to design properly. Then take months. I'm not asking for quick fixes or superficial changes. I'm asking you to reimagine how this foundation engages with community. Victoria's expression softened slightly. I know it's a big ask, but I also know you can do it. You've lived in the neighborhoods we're trying to serve. You've raised a child on limited resources. You understand dignity and respect in ways that most people in this building never will. That's not a disadvantage. That's exactly the expertise we need. Evan left her office that evening with his mind racing, barely noticing the bus ride home. Victoria had essentially handed him permission to rebuild an entire approach to community work, to challenge the foundation's assumptions and practices, to advocate for the kind of authentic engagement he'd always believed in but rarely saw implemented at this scale. It was overwhelming. It was also exactly the kind of work he'd dreamed of doing before life had gotten complicated. Lily noticed his distraction immediately when he picked her up from the after-school program. You're thinking really hard about something, she observed as they walked home together, her purple cast now covered with so many signatures and drawings that the original color was barely visible. I can tell because you get this face. What face? The one where your eyebrows do that thing, Lily demonstrated, scrunching her face in exaggerated concentration. Like you're solving a really hard math problem. Evan laughed despite himself. I guess I am solving a hard problem, a work problem. My boss wants me to figure out a better way to help neighborhoods that need support. That sounds important. It is important. That's why I'm thinking so hard about it. They made dinner together, Lily helping one-handed to stir pasta while Evan assembled a simple sauce from canned tomatoes and garlic. Their evening routine had become smoother over the past few weeks, less frantic now that money wasn't quite so desperately tight. Evan had been able to stock their pantry properly for the first time in months, and the relief of opening a cabinet and seeing actual options instead of scarcity was something he didn't think he'd ever take for granted. After dinner, while Lily did homework at the kitchen table, Evan pulled out his laptop and started making notes. What would genuine community partnership look like? How could a foundation with resources and power actually serve neighborhoods without imposing its own assumptions or priorities? He thought about his own experience, the times when well-meaning people had tried to help in ways that felt more patronizing than supportive. The social worker who'd suggested he put Lily in foster care temporarily after Claire died, completely missing that separating them would have destroyed them both. The bill collector who'd cheerfully recommended financial counseling, as if Evan's problem was poor budgeting rather than insufficient income. The school administrator who'd asked if Lily might be happier at a different school, meaning one with more children from similar circumstances. Not understanding that what Lily needed was normalcy and stability, not segregation by economic status. Real help looked like Mrs. Patterson offering childcare without judgment, like Victoria driving him to the hospital and then giving him a job anyway, like support that preserved dignity instead of demanding gratitude. He was still working when Lily came over to say goodnight, her cast bumping gently against his arm as she hugged him. Don't stay up too late, she said seriously, echoing the words he told her every night. You need sleep to think good. I'll be right behind you, Evan promised, kissing the top of her head. But he worked for another 2 hours after she went to bed, ideas flowing faster than he could capture them. By the time he finally closed his laptop, he had the skeleton of a proposal, not polished or complete, but real. A framework for engagement that started with listening instead of prescribing, that valued community expertise instead of foundation authority, that measured success by relationship rather than transaction. The next morning, Evan presented the rough outline to Victoria over coffee in her office. She listened without interrupting, her attention absolute, and when he finished, she sat back in her chair with an expression he couldn't quite read. This is good, she said finally. Really good. But it's also going to make people uncomfortable. Because it challenges how we've always done things? Because it requires humility, Victoria said. And institutions aren't particularly good at humility. You're essentially proposing that we admit we don't have all the answers, that the people we're trying to serve might know better than we do what they actually need. That's threatening to a lot of people who've built careers on being the experts. Then maybe those people need to be uncomfortable, Evan said, feeling bolder than he'd expected. Victoria smiled at that, something sharp and approving in her expression. I agree completely, but I want you to understand what you're walking into. This kind of change doesn't happen without resistance. Are you prepared for that? Evan thought about the past 2 years, about learning to ask for help, about accepting charity and advocacy from neighbors and strangers, about the hospital bill he still couldn't afford, and the social service systems he'd navigated with Lily. He thought about walking out of this very office 4 weeks ago, choosing his daughter over security, and discovering that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was trust that someone might understand. Yes, he said, I'm prepared. Good. Then let's move forward. Start with Riverside. It's a manageable pilot project, and their executive director, Marcus Williams, is someone I trust. If anyone will be open to this approach, it's him. Set up a meeting, go visit the program, and come back with recommendations for how we can genuinely support what they're doing rather than just writing checks. The Riverside neighborhood was across town, a 40-minute bus ride from Meridian's gleaming downtown offices. Evan made the trip on a Thursday afternoon, watching the city transform as the bus moved away from the commercial district into residential areas that grew progressively more worn. The buildings here were older, many showing signs of deferred maintenance. The businesses were small, bodegas and laundromats and dollar stores, the kind of infrastructure that served communities without much disposable income. It looked like the neighborhood where Evan and Lily lived, just on a larger scale. The Riverside Youth Initiative operated out of a converted warehouse near the river, its exterior painted with a vibrant mural depicting children of all backgrounds reaching toward a bright sky. Inside, the space was organized chaos. Teens working on computers in one corner, younger kids doing homework at tables, staff members circulating with the kind of calm authority that came from genuine care rather than mere supervision. The walls were covered with art projects and academic achievements, a visual testimony to the work being done here. Marcus Williams met Evan in a small office that looked more like a supply closet with a desk crammed in. He was a man in his 50s with gray touching his temples and eyes that assessed Evan with cautious curiosity. Victoria said you wanted to visit, Marcus said, shaking Evan's hand. Most foundation people just want reports and numbers. Not many actually come see the work. That's part of what I'm here to talk about, Evan said. I think we've been approaching community partnership wrong, and I want to understand what actual support looks like from your perspective. Marcus studied him for a long moment. You're not what I expected from Meridian. What did you expect? Someone who'd spend 30 minutes here, take some photos for the annual report, and leave feeling good about themselves. Marcus's tone wasn't hostile, just factual. No offense. None taken. That's exactly the problem I'm trying to fix. Over the next 2 hours, Marcus walked Evan through the program, not the polished version that appeared in grant reports, but the real, complicated, messy truth of serving kids from struggling families in an under-resourced neighborhood. He talked about the teens who came hungry because food ran out at home before the end of the month. The 12-year-old who slept in the center's bathroom because home wasn't safe. The brilliant 15-year-old who'd probably never go to college because nobody in her family understood how financial aid worked. The constant struggle to hire staff who actually understood the community, who could relate to these kids' lives instead of just feeling sorry for them. Here's what foundations don't understand, Marcus said, his voice carrying decades of frustration. We don't just need money. We need trust. We need you to believe that we know what these kids require better than you do. We need flexibility to adapt instead of being locked into rigid grant requirements that made sense to someone who's never set foot in this neighborhood. What would flexibility look like? Evan asked, taking notes. General operating support instead of project-specific grants. Multi-year commitments instead of annual applications. Honest conversations about challenges instead of only reporting successes. Being able to call your office and say, this isn't working, we need to pivot, without worrying you'll pull funding. Marcus leaned back in his chair. We need partners, not funders. There's a difference. Evan spent another hour talking with staff members, and then Marcus introduced him to some of the teens in the program. They were wary at first, clearly used to adults who asked performative questions and then disappeared. But when Evan told them honestly that he was trying to figure out how to make the foundation actually useful instead of just feeling useful, they opened up. They talked about what they needed: better technology, more tutoring support, help navigating college applications, adults who believed in them instead of just pitying them. They were smart and articulate and achingly aware of the systems that were failing them. Most people who come here don't actually listen, a 16-year-old named Jasmine told him. She had bright eyes and a sharp tongue, the kind of intelligence that was clearly fighting against limited opportunities. They ask questions, but you can tell they've already decided what they think, like they need us to perform poverty so they can feel good about helping. I'm trying not to do that, Evan said. But if I slip into that pattern, I want you to call me out. Jasmine looked surprised, then skeptical. For real? For real. I can't fix what I don't understand, and understanding requires actually listening. By the time Evan left Riverside that evening, his notebook was full and his mind was churning. He'd seen excellent work being done with inadequate resources, passionate professionals operating without the support they deserved, and young people who were hungry for opportunity but had no clear path toward accessing it. The foundation's money was helping, certainly, but it could be doing so much more if they approached the relationship differently. He caught the bus back downtown as the sun set, exhausted but energized. His phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Patterson saying Lily was at her apartment doing homework and asking if Evan wanted her to feed his daughter dinner. He responded gratefully, thanking her and saying he'd pick Lily up within the hour. When he arrived at Mrs. Patterson's apartment, 2 floors below his own, Lily was at the kitchen table working on a math worksheet while Mrs. Patterson stirred something that smelled amazing on the stove. There's plenty if you haven't eaten, Mrs. Patterson offered, and Evan realized he'd forgotten lunch entirely. That would be wonderful, thank you. They ate together, Lily chattering about her day while Evan half listened, his mind still processing everything he'd seen at Riverside. Mrs. Patterson noticed his distraction. Big day at work? She asked. Important day, Evan corrected. I'm working on something that could make a real difference if I get it right. You'll get it right, Mrs. Patterson said with the kind of confidence that came from knowing someone well. You're good at seeing what people actually need instead of what looks good on paper. Later that evening, after Lily was asleep, Evan sat at his kitchen table and wrote a detailed report of his Riverside visit, not the sanitized version that grant reports required, but the honest truth of what he'd observed and learned. He wrote about Marcus's frustration with transactional relationships, about Jasmine's skepticism toward adults who performed concern without offering substance, about the gap between what the foundation thought it was providing and what the community actually experienced. He sent the report to Victoria at 11 o'clock that night, too wound up to sleep, and then stared at his laptop screen wondering if he'd been too honest, too critical, too presumptuous for someone who'd only been employed for 4 weeks. Victoria's response came at 6 the next morning. This is exactly what I needed. Come to my office at 8. We have work to do. When Evan arrived at Victoria's office that morning, she had his report printed out with notes in the margins, clearly having read it multiple times. She gestured him to sit and then fixed him with an intense look. This is good work, Evan, honest and insightful. But here's my question. Can you handle the pushback you're going to get when we present this to the board? What kind of pushback? The kind that questions whether community organizations really know better than our program officers. The kind that suggests you're being naive, that we need control mechanisms to ensure accountability. That flexibility is just another word for lack of rigor. Victoria's voice was matter of fact. Some of our board members have been doing philanthropy for 30 years. They're not going to love being told their approach is fundamentally flawed. But it is fundamentally flawed, Evan said. We're treating communities like problems to be solved instead of partners with expertise. I know that. You know that. But convincing people with power to voluntarily share that power, that's not a simple conversation. Victoria set down the report. I'm going to support you completely on this, but I need to know you're prepared for the political dimension of institutional change. This isn't just about good ideas. It's about shifting culture and challenging egos. Evan thought about this, about the comfortable world of ideas versus the messy reality of implementation. What if we start small? Pilot the new approach with Riverside, document the outcomes, and use that evidence to make the case for broader change? That's smart, Victoria said. Build credibility through results before asking for systemic transformation. I like it. They spent the next hour developing a plan, a 6-month pilot with Riverside that would test the partnership model Evan was proposing. Instead of a standard grant with rigid deliverables, they'd offer general operating support with collaborative goal setting. Instead of quarterly reports focused on metrics, they'd have monthly conversations about challenges and adaptations. Instead of the foundation dictating terms, they'd ask Riverside what support would actually be most useful. This could fail spectacularly, Victoria warned. If Riverside doesn't produce the outcomes we're hoping for, or if something goes wrong, the board will use that as evidence that traditional grant-making is the only responsible approach. But if it succeeds, Evan countered, we'll have proof that trusting communities leads to better outcomes than controlling them. Exactly. That's why I'm willing to take the risk. Victoria signed off on the budget allocation, making the pilot official with a few strokes of her pen. Set up a meeting with Marcus, explain what we're proposing, and Evan, make sure he understands this isn't charity or an experiment. This is us acknowledging that they're the experts in their own community and we're learning from them. The meeting with Marcus happened the following week, this time at the Meridian offices at his request. Evan met him in the lobby, watching Marcus take in the expensive architecture and sleek design with an expression that was carefully neutral. They rode the elevator in silence, and Evan found himself seeing his workplace through Marcus's eyes. The obvious wealth, the implicit barriers, the unspoken message that this was a place for people who belonged to a very specific world. In a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows, Evan laid out the proposal. Marcus listened without interrupting, his expression giving away nothing. When Evan finished, silence stretched between them. "What's the catch?" Marcus asked finally. "There's no catch." "There's always a catch." Marcus's tone wasn't aggressive, just tired. "Foundations don't just hand over money with no strings attached. So what are you actually asking for?" "Honest partnership," Evan said simply. "We want to support your work without micromanaging it. We want to learn from your expertise instead of assuming ours is more valid. And yes, we want you to be transparent with us about challenges and setbacks, but not because we're looking for reasons to pull funding, because we want to problem solve together." Marcus studied him carefully. "Why?" "Because the traditional model isn't working, because we've been operating from assumptions rather than understanding, because you know what your community needs better than we ever will, and it's arrogant for us to pretend otherwise." Evan met Marcus's skeptical gaze directly. "And because I've been on the receiving end of systems that claim to help but mostly just made me feel small, I don't want this foundation to be that kind of place." Something shifted in Marcus's expression. "You've been poor." It wasn't a question, but Evan answered anyway. "I am poor. Or I was until very recently. Single father, unemployed for 2 years, living in a building that's one rent increase away from displacement. So yeah, I understand what it feels like to be on the other side of these conversations." "That why Victoria hired you?" "Partly. Also because I'm good at this work." Evan smiled slightly. "But the lived experience probably didn't hurt." Marcus leaned back in his chair, something cautious and hopeful crossing his face. "If we do this, if we accept this pilot arrangement, I need you to understand something. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to have months where the outcomes aren't what we hoped. There will be kids we can't reach and problems we can't solve. And I need to know you're not going to pull funding the first time things get messy." "We won't," Evan promised. "But I also need you to tell us when things aren't working. If this approach isn't actually helpful, if we're getting in your way or creating new problems, I need to know that. The whole point is to learn what genuine support looks like." "In my experience, foundations say they want honesty, but they actually want success stories they can put in annual reports," Marcus said. "Can you handle the truth even when it's uncomfortable?" "That's literally what we're asking for," Evan said. "Uncomfortable truth is more useful than comfortable illusion." They talked for another hour, working through logistics and expectations, and by the end, Marcus's skepticism had shifted into something that looked almost like cautious optimism. They shook hands in the lobby, and Marcus paused before leaving. "I'm going to trust you," he said. "But Evan, don't make me regret it. These kids deserve better than another foundation that promises partnership and delivers paternalism." "I know," Evan said quietly. "I promise we'll do better." When Victoria asked how the meeting went, Evan told her honestly that Marcus was giving them a chance but would be watching carefully for signs of the same old patterns. "Good," Victoria said. "We should be held accountable. That's the point." The pilot launched officially the following month, and Evan found himself spending increasing amounts of time at Riverside, building relationships with staff and young people, learning the rhythm and culture of the organization. He sat in on staff meetings and tutoring sessions, helped with college application workshops, and listened to the constant problem-solving that community work required. It was exhausting and illuminating and occasionally heartbreaking, and it reminded him why he'd chosen this profession in the first place. Lily noticed the change in her father. The energy that had been missing for so long was returning. The sense of purpose that had died with Claire was slowly rebuilding. One evening, as they cooked dinner together, she asked him about it. "You seem happy, Dad. Like really happy, not just okay happy." Evan thought about this as he chopped vegetables. "I think I am happy, or getting there anyway. The work feels important, like I'm doing something that matters." "You were always doing something that matters," Lily said seriously. "You were taking care of me. That matters most." Evan set down his knife, pulled his daughter into a one-armed hug. "You're absolutely right. But maybe now I get to do both, take care of you and do work that helps other people. That feels good." "Then I'm glad," Lily said, hugging him back. "You deserve to feel good." Standing in their small kitchen with his daughter in his arms, Evan felt something settle in his chest that had been restless for years. He wasn't the same person he'd been before Claire died. He couldn't be. Grief had changed him too fundamentally. But maybe that was okay. Maybe the version of himself he was becoming, shaped by loss and struggle and unexpected kindness, was someone who could do important work precisely because he understood what it felt like to need help, because he knew the difference between support that uplifted and charity that diminished, because he'd learned that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was walk away from what looked like security in order to protect what actually mattered. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, you'd find that walking away was actually the first step toward building something better than you'd imagined possible. The Riverside pilot consumed Evan's professional life for the next 3 months, but in a way that felt generative rather than draining. He found himself thinking about the work during his commute, dreaming solutions to challenges in the middle of the night, and feeling genuinely excited to go into the office each morning. It was the kind of engagement he'd forgotten was possible. The sense that what he did during work hours actually mattered beyond a paycheck. The partnership with Marcus and his team evolved in ways Evan hadn't anticipated. Instead of the formal quarterly reviews that standard grants required, they developed a rhythm of weekly check-ins over coffee at a diner halfway between their respective offices. These conversations were messy and honest, full of frustrations and small victories, setbacks and unexpected breakthroughs. Marcus would talk about the 16-year-old who'd finally opened up about the violence at home, or the college acceptance letter that arrived for a student everyone had written off, or the staff member who quit because the emotional weight of the work became unbearable. And Evan would listen, ask questions, and figure out how the foundation's resources could actually support what was happening rather than impose external priorities. One particularly difficult conversation happened on a rainy Tuesday morning 6 weeks into the pilot. Marcus looked exhausted, his usual energy depleted by something more than routine tiredness. He ordered his coffee black and then stared at it without drinking. "We lost a kid last week," he said finally, his voice flat. "Jamal, 15 years old. Shot in a dispute that had nothing to do with him, just wrong place at the wrong time. He was supposed to graduate from our tutoring program next month." Evan felt the words hit him like physical force. "Marcus, I'm so sorry. He was a good kid, smart, funny, loved basketball, and wanted to be an engineer." Marcus's hands tightened around his coffee cup. "And now he's gone, and I have to figure out how to tell his friends that their world just got smaller and more dangerous. I have to comfort staff members who are questioning whether any of this matters if kids can still just die on their way home from school." "Does it matter?" Evan asked quietly. Not a challenge. I'm genuinely asking. On days like this, does the work still feel worth it? Marcus was silent for a long time, his gaze distant. I don't know how to answer that. Because no, it doesn't feel worth it when a 15-year-old is dead. But also yes, because what's the alternative? We stop trying? We let every kid in Riverside believe their lives don't matter and their futures are already written? He finally took a drink of his coffee, winced at how bitter it was. The work matters. It just doesn't matter enough. We can't save everyone, and that reality is something I can't ever get used to. What do you need? Evan asked. From us, from the foundation. What would actually help right now? Honestly, I need space to grieve without having to perform resilience for funders. I need to cancel our staff meeting this week and not worry that you'll think we're being irresponsible. I need to know that when I send in this month's report and it's full of sadness instead of success metrics, you won't see that as failure. Marcus met Evan's eyes directly. I need you to understand that community work is sometimes about bearing witness to tragedy, and that has value even when it doesn't produce the outcomes that look good in board presentations. Then take the space you need, Evan said immediately. Cancel whatever you need to cancel, and when you write the report, tell the truth about what this week was like. I promise you, Victoria and I understand that real work with real people means sitting with real grief sometimes. Most foundations wouldn't accept that, Marcus said. They want us to be machines that convert their money into measurable impact. They don't want to acknowledge that we're humans working with humans in situations that are often desperately unfair. Then most foundations are failing at the most basic requirement of partnership, seeing the people they claim to serve as fully human. Evan pulled out his phone, sent a quick text to Victoria explaining the situation and recommending they pause all reporting requirements for the month. Her response came within minutes. Agreed. Let me know what they need. He showed Marcus the exchange. Something in the older man's expression cracked slightly, the exhaustion momentarily giving way to surprise. You really meant what you said, Marcus said, about trust and partnership. You weren't just performing progressive language. I meant every word, and I'm sorry it took something this terrible for you to believe that. Evan hesitated, then decided to share something he rarely talked about. My wife died 2 years ago, cancer, and the thing I remember most from that time isn't the big gestures or the dramatic support. It's the people who let me fall apart without trying to fix it. The neighbor who sat with me while I cried and didn't tell me it would get better. The grief counselor who said it was okay to be angry at the universe. The people who understood that sometimes there are no solutions, just the need to be witnessed in your pain. Marcus nodded slowly. How did you survive it? Barely. One day at a time. And my daughter, she needed me to function, so I functioned. But I'm not going to lie to you and say I'm fully healed or that time makes it better. It just makes it different. Evan finished his own coffee, cold now, but he drank it anyway. What I learned is that the only thing worse than grief is people who want you to hurry through it. So take whatever time you need. The foundation will still be here when you're ready. They sat in silence for a while, two men who'd been strangers 3 months ago now, connected by shared understanding of loss and the complicated work of continuing despite it. Eventually, Marcus pulled himself together enough to head back to Riverside, where his staff and students would need him to be strong, even though he felt shattered. Evan watched him go and then sat alone in the diner for another half hour, thinking about Jamal and all the other young people whose futures were stolen by circumstances they didn't create and couldn't control. When he got back to the office, Victoria was waiting in his doorway. I heard about Riverside, she said quietly. Are you okay? No, Evan said honestly, and I don't think I should be. A kid is dead. Being okay with that would be concerning. Fair point. Victoria came into his office, closed the door behind her. I told the board we're pausing the formal evaluation timeline for the pilot. I didn't ask permission, I just informed them. We'll revisit in a month when everyone has had time to process. Thank you. Marcus needs that space. So do you, Victoria said, studying him carefully. You're more invested in this work than I realized. That's good, but it's also dangerous. You can't pour yourself out indefinitely without refilling somehow. I'm fine, Evan said automatically, then caught himself. Or I will be. This is just hard. Necessary work, but hard. Victoria nodded, recognizing the deflection but letting it stand. Take the afternoon off if you need to. Go pick up Lily early from school. Sometimes the best response to tragedy is holding the people you love a little closer. So Evan did exactly that. He left the office at 2 o'clock, took the bus across town to Washington Elementary, and was waiting outside when the final bell rang. Lily emerged with her backpack and her purple cast. The fracture was healing well, just 2 more weeks until removal, and her face lit up when she saw him. "Dad, what are you doing here? It's early." "Thought I'd surprise you," Evan said, opening his arms for a hug. "Want to go get ice cream?" "It's Tuesday afternoon. You never let me have ice cream on Tuesdays. Today's different. Come on." They walked to the ice cream shop near the park, Lily chattering about her day while Evan listened and tried to be present instead of thinking about Jamal or Marcus or the impossible weight of trying to make systemic change in a world that seemed designed to resist it. He bought them both cones, chocolate chip for Lily, plain vanilla for himself, and they sat on a bench watching other children play. "Dad, is something wrong?" Lily asked after a while, her perceptiveness as sharp as always. "Something sad happened at work today," Evan said carefully. "A young person died. Someone who was part of a program we support." "That's really sad." Lily was quiet for a moment, licking her ice cream thoughtfully. "Were they sick like Mom?" "No, baby. It was violence, just a terrible random thing that shouldn't have happened." Lily leaned against her father's side, her cast bumping gently against his ribs. "I'm sorry you had a sad day. Do you want to talk about it, or do you want to just eat ice cream and not talk?" Evan felt his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. His 8-year-old daughter, asking him what he needed in his grief, offering him the same kind of presents he tried to give her. "Ice cream and no talking sounds perfect," he managed. They sat together in companionable silence until their cones were finished, and then walked home slowly, Lily's hand in his. When they got back to their apartment, she did homework at the kitchen table while Evan started dinner, and the ordinary rhythm of their evening routine helped smooth some of the jagged edges of the day. This was what mattered, he reminded himself, not the programs or the grants or the outcome metrics. Just this, being present for the child who needed him, creating safety and stability in a world that offered far too little of either. The month after Jamal's death was difficult in ways Evan hadn't anticipated. The Riverside team was grieving collectively, their usual energy subdued, and the work took on a different quality, more protective, more urgent, as if by intensifying their efforts they could somehow prevent the next tragedy. Marcus and his staff organized a memorial service that Evan attended, sitting in the back of a crowded community center while teenagers and teachers and family members shared stories about a boy who'd been funny and kind and full of potential. Victoria came with him, both of them representing the foundation, and afterward they stayed to help clean up even though no one asked them to. "This is the part they don't show in the annual reports," Victoria said quietly as they stacked chairs. "The human cost of working in under-resourced communities, the knowledge that you can't save everyone no matter how hard you try." "How do you not burn out?" Evan asked. "You've been doing this work for decades. How do you keep going when the losses are this painful?" "Honestly, I don't always. There have been times when I've wanted to walk away, to find a job that doesn't require carrying other people's grief." Victoria paused, a chair in her hands. "But then I remember what Margaret told me once. She said that bearing witness to people's struggles, really seeing them and acknowledging their worth, that's sacred work even when it doesn't lead to happy endings. And someone has to do it. Someone has to care enough to keep showing up." "So we just keep showing up?" "We keep showing up," Victoria confirmed, "and we trust that the accumulation of small acts of dignity and respect eventually shifts something larger. We might not see the transformation in our lifetime, but that doesn't mean it's not happening." By the time Lily's cast came off 6 weeks into the pilot, Evan felt like he'd aged a decade. The work was rewarding but relentless, and he was learning that authentic community partnership meant absorbing a constant stream of hard truths and impossible situations. But he was also seeing small victories, the way Marcus now called him first when challenges arose, trusting that Evan would respond with support rather than judgment. The way Riverside staff members had started including him in informal conversations, treating him less like a foundation representative and more like someone who genuinely cared about their work. The way the young people in the program had stopped being wary around him and started actually talking, sharing their dreams and frustrations with the kind of honesty that only came from feeling safe. The cast removal appointment was on a Friday afternoon, and Evan left work early to take Lily to the orthopedist. She was both excited and nervous, chattering about how itchy her arm had been and how she'd miss all the signatures on the cast, but also really wanted to scratch the skin underneath. The doctor used a small saw that made Lily nervous until she realized it didn't hurt, and then her arm emerged pale and slightly withered from 8 weeks of immobility. "It looks weird," Lily said, staring at her arm with fascination and mild horror. "It'll strengthen up quickly," the doctor assured her. "Give it a few weeks of normal use and you won't notice any difference." They stopped for celebratory pizza on the way home, and Lily used both hands to eat for the first time in 2 months, clearly delighted by the simple freedom of it. Evan watched her and felt grateful for this ordinary moment, this evidence that broken things could heal given time and proper support. If only everything in life could be fixed as straightforwardly as a fractured bone. That weekend, Evan finally sat down to write the 3-month evaluation report for the Riverside pilot. He'd been putting it off, uncertain how to capture the complexity of what they'd experienced in language that would satisfy the board's desire for measurable outcomes. But as he began writing, he realized that the truth was actually the most compelling narrative he could offer. So he wrote about Marcus's initial skepticism and gradual trust, about the staff members who'd opened up once they realized the foundation wouldn't punish them for admitting challenges, about Jamal's death and the month of grief that followed and what the foundation had learned by sitting with that pain instead of rushing past it, about the subtle shifts in relationship that didn't show up in quantitative metrics but represented fundamental transformation in how power and partnership operated. He sent the draft to Victoria late Sunday night, half expecting her to tell him it was too honest, too raw, too unmarketable for the board's consumption. Instead, her response came Monday morning with a single word: perfect. The board presentation was scheduled for the following week, and Victoria spent hours with Evan preparing him for the kinds of questions he'd likely face. She coached him through potential objections, helped him develop responses that acknowledged concerns while standing firm on the pilot's underlying principles. The night before the presentation, Evan barely slept, running through his talking points and worrying that he'd fumble or fail or somehow undermine all the work they'd done. The boardroom was even more intimidating than Evan had imagined. A massive table surrounded by 18 people who collectively controlled hundreds of millions of dollars in philanthropic resources. They were mostly older, mostly white, mostly people whose relationship to wealth and power was so normalized they probably didn't even think about it consciously. Victoria introduced Evan with warmth and confidence, and then he launched into his presentation. He spoke for 20 minutes, walking through the pilot's design and implementation, sharing specific examples and honest reflections. He talked about Jamal, about the importance of trust over control, about measuring success through relationship quality rather than just transaction completion. When he finished, the room was silent for a long moment. Then the questions began. "This all sounds very nice," said a woman in her 60s with expensive jewelry and a skeptical expression. "But how do we ensure accountability without oversight? How do we know our resources are being used effectively if we're not requiring detailed reporting?" Evan had anticipated this question. "We are requiring reporting," he said calmly. "Just different reporting. Instead of quarterly documents full of statistics, we have weekly conversations where Marcus and his team share what's actually happening. Successes, failures, challenges, adaptations. We're getting more information this way, not less. It's just information that's useful for learning rather than just information that makes us feel comfortable." "But that's not scalable," another board member objected. "Weekly conversations work for one organization. What happens when you try to apply this model to all our community partners? You can't have coffee meetings with 50 different executive directors every week." "You're right that we'd need to adapt the implementation," Evan acknowledged, "but the underlying principles absolutely scale: trust, flexibility, honoring community expertise, measuring relationships alongside outcomes. The specific tactics might vary, but the philosophy can inform all our partnerships." A man at the far end of the table, who'd been silent until now, spoke up. "I knew Jamal's family," he said quietly. "Not well, but through community connections. His death was a tragedy that could have happened whether we funded Riverside or not. But I want to know, do you think our partnership made any difference? Could we have prevented that loss if we'd done something differently? Evan appreciated the honesty of the question. No, he said firmly. We couldn't have prevented Jamal's death. That's the hard truth. What we can do, what I believe this partnership is doing, is create spaces where young people like Jamal feel valued and supported while they're alive, where they have access to opportunities and relationships that affirm their worth. We can't protect them from systemic violence, but we can refuse to add to the ways this world diminishes them. That matters even when it doesn't lead to perfect outcomes. The board member nodded slowly, something like understanding in his expression. The questions continued for another 45 minutes, some hostile, some genuinely curious, all demanding that Evan defend a model that challenged their fundamental assumptions about how philanthropy should operate. He stumbled occasionally, admitted uncertainty when he didn't have answers, and held his ground on the core principles even when pushed. Victoria interjected occasionally to provide context or redirect particularly aggressive questions, but mostly she let Evan speak for himself. When the questioning finally ended, the board chair called for a vote on whether to extend the pilot for another 6 months. Evan wasn't allowed to stay for the deliberation, so he waited in Victoria's office while they discussed and decided his professional fate. "You did really well," Victoria said, pouring him a glass of water that he drank in 3 gulps. "Better than most people do their first time presenting to this board." "I feel like I barely survived," Evan admitted. "Some of those questions were brutal." "That's how they test whether you actually believe what you're saying or if you're just performing progressive values," Victoria explained. "They want people who can defend their positions under pressure, and you did that." 20 minutes later, Victoria's phone buzzed with a text from the board chair. She read it, and a smile crossed her face. "They voted to extend the pilot," she said, 15-3. "You just got 6 more months to prove this model works." Evan felt relief wash over him so intensely that he had to sit down. "Thank you for preparing me, for supporting me, for everything." "Thank me by continuing to do excellent work," Victoria said. "And Evan, that presentation wasn't just about the pilot. You made several board members genuinely uncomfortable, which means you challenged them to think differently. That's valuable, even if they didn't vote your way." That evening, Evan picked up Lily from the after-school program and took her out to dinner at a real restaurant, not pizza or takeout, but actual sit-down service with menus and everything. They couldn't afford to do this often, but today felt like it warranted celebration. "Why are we being fancy?" Lily asked, looking around the restaurant with wide eyes. "Because Dad had a really good day at work," Evan explained. "And because you've been so patient and understanding while I've been stressed about this big project. I wanted to do something special for both of us." They ordered more food than they needed and talked about everything except work. Lily's upcoming science fair project, her friend's birthday party next month, whether they should try to adopt a cat even though their apartment was small. It was ordinary conversation, the kind that had felt impossible 2 years ago when grief consumed everything, and Evan treasured every mundane minute of it. When they got home that night, Lily gave him an extra long hug before bed. "I'm really proud of you, Dad," she said seriously. "I don't totally understand what you do at work, but I know you're helping people. That's important." "You're what's most important," Evan told her, kissing her forehead. "Everything else is just what I do. You're who I am." After she fell asleep, Evan stood in her doorway for a long time, watching her breathe, feeling grateful for this child who'd saved him as much as he'd protected her. The past 2 years had been brutal. Losing Claire, scrambling for survival, accepting help from neighbors and strangers, walking away from that interview, and somehow finding himself here, doing work that mattered with people who respected him. It hadn't been the path he'd expected or wanted, but maybe that was okay. Maybe the broken places could become foundations for something new. Maybe walking away from what looked like security could lead to building something better. The next morning, Evan called Marcus to share the board's decision. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "They actually extended the pilot?" Marcus said finally. "After everything, after Jamal, after all my honesty about how hard this work is, they still want to continue?" They do. And Marcus, I think we're actually proving something here. That trust works better than control. That community expertise matters more than foundation assumptions. That real partnership requires uncomfortable honesty rather than performative success. Don't make me cry at work, Marcus said, his voice rough with emotion. We've got a full day of programming and I need to maintain some professional dignity. Too late, Evan said, smiling even though Marcus couldn't see him. But seriously, thank you for taking a chance on this. For trusting us even when you had every reason not to. For teaching us what partnership actually looks like. Thank you for listening, Marcus replied simply. That's rarer than you might think. As Evan ended the call and returned to reviewing grant applications at his desk, he realized that this was what transformation looked like. Not dramatic moments or sweeping changes, but the slow, patient work of building trust across difference, of showing up consistently, of being willing to be uncomfortable and uncertain and occasionally wrong, of measuring success not just by outcomes, but by the quality of relationships created along the way. It was harder than he'd expected and more rewarding than he'd imagined, and he was finally beginning to understand that the interview he'd walked away from hadn't been an ending at all. It had been the beginning of becoming someone who knew that courage sometimes looked like leaving, and that the strongest foundations were built not on certainty, but on the willingness to trust even when trust felt risky. He'd gambled everything on being a good father, and somehow that choice had led him here, to work that honored both his professional skills and his deepest values, to relationships built on authenticity rather than performance, to a future that felt genuinely possible instead of merely survivable. And that, Evan was learning, was worth every uncomfortable moment along the way. 6 months after the board's decision to extend the Riverside pilot, Evan found himself standing in front of the same intimidating boardroom, preparing to present the final evaluation. But this time, Marcus stood beside him, and that changed everything. Victoria had insisted that the community partner should be part of the presentation, that the board needed to hear directly from someone doing the actual work, rather than just the foundation's interpretation of it. Several board members had initially resisted, concerned about maintaining appropriate professional boundaries, but Victoria had been immovable on this point. If we're really committed to partnership, she told them firmly, then we need to share the platform, not just the outcomes. Marcus had been nervous about it, spending hours with Evan preparing, worried that he'd say something wrong or damage the pilot's chances of becoming permanent programming. But Evan had coached him the same way Victoria had coached Evan months earlier, not to perform or sanitize, but to tell the truth about what the past 9 months had actually been like. Now, as they waited for the board to settle into their seats, Marcus leaned over and whispered, I still can't believe I'm doing this. This room probably costs more than my annual salary. They need to hear from you, Evan whispered back. Your voice matters more than mine here. The presentation they'd prepared together was different from the one Evan had delivered alone months earlier. This time, they wove together two perspectives, Evan's analysis of what the foundation had learned about partnership, and Marcus's honest account of what it had felt like to be trusted rather than managed. They talked about specific young people whose trajectories had shifted because staff members had resources and flexibility to respond to emerging needs rather than rigid program requirements. They acknowledged the ongoing challenges, including the reality that some problems were too large for any single foundation to solve. And they presented data that showed measurable improvements in program participation and student outcomes, but contextualized those numbers within the larger story of relationship and trust. Evan spoke first, laying out the framework and principles. Then he turned to Marcus. But I'm not the one who's been doing the actual work, Evan said. Marcus, can you talk about what this pilot has meant from Riverside's perspective? Marcus stepped forward, and for a moment Evan could see the nervousness in his posture. But then Marcus began speaking, and his voice steadied with the authority of someone who knew his subject intimately. When Evan first approached us about this partnership model, I didn't believe him, Marcus said bluntly. I've been doing community work for 23 years, and I've worked with a lot of foundations. Most of them say they want partnership, but what they really want is control with friendlier language. They want us to implement their priorities, achieve their metrics, and perform gratitude for resources that come with so many strings attached, they're barely useful. Several board members shifted uncomfortably. Marcus noticed but didn't soften his words. So, When Evan said Meridian wanted to trust us, to be flexible, to learn from our expertise, I thought it was too good to be true. And for the first few weeks, I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the moment when the foundation would start adding requirements or questioning our decisions or making us justify every dollar spent. But that moment never came, Marcus continued, his voice gaining strength. Instead, when one of our students was killed and our whole team was grieving, the foundation gave us space. When we had to pivot our tutoring program because we realized our original approach wasn't working, they supported the change instead of penalizing us for deviation from the plan. When we needed emergency funding to help a family facing eviction, a family whose stability was essential to keeping 3 kids in our program, Evan got us the money within 48 hours. He paused, looking around the room at these powerful people who controlled so much wealth and influence. That's what real partnership looks like, Marcus said quietly. Not transactions, not oversight disguised as collaboration, but actual trust. The belief that we know our community and our kids better than anyone sitting in this building ever could, no matter how good your intentions are. And here's what happened when you gave us that trust. We did better work. Our staff stopped spending 20 hours a week on grant reports and spent that time with young people instead. We took smart risks because we knew failure wouldn't mean punishment. We built relationships with families because we had flexibility to meet them where they were rather than forcing them to fit into predetermined program boxes. Marcus pulled out a sheet of paper covered with names written in different colored inks, some in adult handwriting, some in the uncertain script of children. These are the students who've been part of Riverside this year, he said. 47 young people. Some are thriving, some are struggling, some we've probably lost despite our best efforts. But every single one of them experienced a place where adults believed in them, where their potential wasn't defined by their zip code or their parents' income or the color of their skin. That's what your money bought when you trusted us to use it wisely. Not perfect outcomes, not glossy success stories, but dignity, possibility. The message that someone cares enough to keep showing up. The room was completely silent. Marcus handed the paper to Evan, who set it on the table where everyone could see it. "We're not asking you to stop caring about outcomes," Evan said, picking up where Marcus left off. "We're asking you to expand your definition of what outcomes matter. Yes, we want kids to improve academically and graduate and go to college, but we also want them to know they're valued, to experience adults who see their full humanity, to believe that the world can be different from what they've been told to expect. Those outcomes are harder to measure, but they're not less important." The questions that followed were different from the ones Evan had faced months earlier. Board members asked Marcus directly about challenges and sustainability, about how to scale this approach, about what other supports Riverside needed that the foundation wasn't currently providing. Marcus answered with the same unvarnished honesty he'd brought to the presentation, never softening hard truths, but also making clear that this partnership had fundamentally changed how his organization could operate. When the questioning ended and the board asked Marcus and Evan to step out for their deliberation, they waited in Victoria's office again. But this time, Marcus was there too, and the 3 of them sat in companionable silence that spoke to genuine partnership rather than hierarchical relationship. "Whatever they decide," Marcus said eventually, "I want you both to know that this year changed things for us. Even if they don't make it permanent, even if we go back to traditional grant structures, I'll always know that a different approach is possible. That matters." "They're going to make it permanent," Victoria said with quiet confidence. "I've been reading this board for 15 years. They're convinced." She was right. When the board chair called them back in, his expression was warm rather than neutral. "We voted unanimously to make the community partnership model permanent foundation policy," he announced. "Not just for Riverside, but as our default approach to all community investments. We're allocating additional resources to hire staff who can manage relationships rather than just transactions, and we're revising our evaluation frameworks to emphasize the principles you've outlined." Evan felt something huge and bright expand in his chest. Beside him, Marcus's hand gripped his arm, the pressure speaking to emotion that words couldn't quite capture. "This is going to require significant organizational change," the chair continued, "and we're asking you, Evan, to lead that transition. We're creating a new position, Vice President of Community Partnership, and we want you in that role. You'll work directly with Victoria to redesign our approach across all program areas." Evan's voice caught. I'm honored. Thank you. Don't thank us yet, one of the board members said with a slight smile. You're about to have the hardest job in this building. Changing institutional culture is brutal work. But necessary work, Victoria added, and I can't think of anyone better suited for it. The celebration that followed was unlike anything Evan had experienced in his professional life. Victoria took him and Marcus out to dinner at an elegant restaurant where Marcus kept muttering about the prices and Evan kept forgetting to eat because he was so overwhelmed by what had just happened. They talked about implementation strategies and timeline and the challenges ahead, but underneath the practical conversation was a current of something deeper, the recognition that they'd accomplished something genuinely meaningful together. They'd proved that trust and flexibility could coexist with accountability, that honoring community expertise produced better outcomes than imposing external priorities, that real partnership required foundations to share power rather than just distribute money. When Evan finally made it home that night, much later than usual, he found Lily asleep on the couch with Mrs. Patterson reading in the chair beside her. His neighbor looked up when he entered, took in his expression, and smiled. "Good day?" she asked quietly. "Extraordinary day," Evan said, still trying to process it all. "I got promoted, and the project I've been working on, it's going to become how the whole foundation operates." "I knew you'd do something important," Mrs. Patterson said, standing to leave. "Your wife would be so proud." The words hit Evan unexpectedly hard. Claire. She'd never know about this job, this transformation, the way their daughter was thriving despite everything. She'd never see how Evan had rebuilt a life from the rubble of loss. For a moment, grief and joy tangled so thoroughly he couldn't separate them. "Thank you," he managed, "for everything, for helping with Lily, for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself." "That's what neighbors do," Mrs. Patterson said simply, patting his arm as she headed for the door. "That's what people do when they actually see each other as human beings deserving of care. You're teaching that to an entire foundation now. Keep going." After she left, Evan lifted his sleeping daughter and carried her to her bed, tucking her in with the practiced movements of 2 years of single parenthood. She stirred slightly, mumbled something about homework, and then settled back into sleep. Evan sat on the edge of her bed for a long time, watching her breathe, thinking about the morning he'd walked out of an interview because she'd needed him. That choice had felt like the end of everything. Instead, it had been the beginning of something he'd never imagined possible. The next few months were intense as Evan stepped into his new role and began the work of institutional transformation. He hired a team of community partnership specialists who came from nonprofit backgrounds rather than traditional philanthropy, people who understood the work from the inside rather than the outside. He developed new evaluation frameworks that honored qualitative outcomes alongside quantitative data. He spent weeks traveling to meet with the foundation's existing community partners, listening to their frustrations with current systems and their hopes for what partnership could actually look like. And slowly, incrementally, the culture began to shift. It wasn't easy. Evan encountered resistance from program officers who'd built careers on the old model, who saw the new approach as criticism of their work rather than evolution towards something better. He had difficult conversations about power and privilege, about how good intentions didn't excuse paternalistic practices. He made mistakes, moved too fast sometimes, communicated poorly, underestimated how threatening change felt to people invested in existing structures. But Victoria supported him through every misstep, coaching him through the political complexities of organizational change while giving him enough autonomy to develop his own leadership style. 6 months into his new position, Evan was invited to speak at a national philanthropy conference about the community partnership model. The audience was filled with foundation professionals, nonprofit leaders, and academics who studied social change, and Evan felt the familiar nervousness of high-stakes presentations. But he'd learned by now that authenticity was more powerful than polish, that people responded to truth-telling even when, especially when, that truth was uncomfortable. He talked about walking out of his interview, about the desperation of single parenthood on limited resources, about what it had felt like to need help and to navigate systems that claimed to support families like his while actually making everything harder. He talked about Marcus and Riverside, about Jamal's death and the importance of bearing witness to tragedy without trying to fix everything. He talked about the board's initial skepticism and eventual transformation, about the way institutional change happened through the accumulation of small, brave choices rather than grand, dramatic gestures. The question I get asked most often, Evan said near the end of his talk, is how foundations can know if they're really doing partnership right. And my answer is always the same. Ask the people you claim to be partnering with, not in formal evaluation surveys or annual site visits, but in real ongoing conversations where there's actual space for criticism without fear of punishment. If your community partners tell you you're doing great, you might be. But if they're reluctant to share challenges or frustrated by your processes or spending enormous energy managing your expectations rather than serving their communities, then you're probably doing partnership wrong, no matter how progressive your language sounds. The applause after his talk was sustained, and the questions that followed suggested he'd touched something real. Multiple people approached him afterward, wanting to learn more, to figure out how to implement similar models at their own organizations. Evan exchanged contact information and promised follow-up conversations, feeling both energized and exhausted by the attention. On the flight home that evening, he texted Lily a photo of the conference hall with the caption, "Talk to a lot of people about being a good dad, and it turns out that's also about being good at my job. Miss you. Home tomorrow." Her response came quickly. "That's because you're the best at both. Mrs. Patterson made lasagna. I saved you some." The simple domesticity of that message, the assurance of saved lasagna and a daughter who loved him, grounded Evan in what actually mattered. The conference was important, the foundation work was transformative, but none of it meant anything if he lost sight of the reason he'd started this journey. Lily, always Lily, the child who'd saved him as much as he'd protected her. A year after the board's decision to make community partnership permanent policy, Victoria called Evan into her office for what she said was an important conversation. He'd learned to read her expressions well enough by now to know this wasn't bad news, but the seriousness in her demeanor suggested significance. "I'm retiring," she said without preamble, "at the end of this fiscal year. I've been here for 18 years, and it's time." Evan felt shock ripple through him. "You're not that old. You have years left if you want them." "I'm 54 and I'm tired," Victoria said with a slight smile. "Not burned out, just ready for the next chapter. I want to spend time with my son, maybe do some consulting work that doesn't require managing a large team. I want to read books in the middle of the day and not feel guilty about it." I'm happy for you," Evan said, meaning it even as he processed what her departure would mean for him and the work they'd built together. "But the foundation won't be the same without you." "That's the point," Victoria said. "Institutions shouldn't be dependent on individual leaders. We've built something sustainable here, a model and a culture that can outlive both of us. And Evan, the board wants you to be the next vice president of community relations. My job, if you want it." The offer hung in the air between them, enormous with possibility and responsibility. "That's a significant promotion," Evan said carefully, "and a lot of responsibility. I've only been in my current role for a year." "You've transformed this organization in that year," Victoria countered. "You've changed how we think about power and partnership, how we measure success, how we engage with communities. The board sees what I see, that you're not just good at this work, you're essential to it, because you understand something most foundation leaders never learn, that the people closest to problems are usually closest to solutions, and our job is to support their wisdom rather than impose ours." Evan thought about this, about the trajectory from that desperate morning when he'd walked out of an interview to this moment when he was being offered leadership of an entire foundation division. About Lily growing up with the security he'd fought so hard to provide. About Marcus and the countless other community leaders who deserved partners rather than funders. About Claire, who'd never see any of this, but whose loss had somehow prepared him for exactly this work. "Yes," he said finally. "Yes, I want the position. And Victoria, thank you for everything, for taking a chance on me when you had no reason to, for mentoring me through this work, for showing me what leadership with integrity actually looks like." "Thank me by continuing to do excellent work," Victoria said, echoing the words she'd spoken to him so many times before. "And by being for someone else what I tried to be for you, the person who sees potential and makes space for it to develop." The transition happened gradually over the following months. Evan moved into Victoria's role while she stayed on as a consultant to help with the handoff, and he discovered that leadership at this level was both harder and more meaningful than he'd anticipated. He had budget authority over tens of millions of dollars, supervised a team of 15 staff members, and represented the foundation at events and conferences where his words carried institutional weight. But he also had the power to make decisions that genuinely impacted communities, to direct resources toward work that mattered, to model the kind of humble, relational leadership that he believed philanthropy desperately needed. On Victoria's last day, the foundation threw a retirement party in the building's largest conference room. Staff members shared stories about her impact, her mentorship, her willingness to challenge conventional wisdom. When it was Evan's turn to speak, he kept it brief. "Victoria taught me that walking away from security to protect what matters isn't weakness," he said. "It's the foundation of integrity. She taught me that trust is more powerful than control, that community expertise deserves respect, and that the best leaders make themselves obsolete by building systems that don't require them. I hope to honor her legacy by continuing that work." Victoria hugged him after the party ended, and in that embrace was the weight of everything they'd built together, not just programs and policies, but a genuine friendship forged through shared values and mutual respect. "You're going to be extraordinary at this," she told him. "And Evan, don't let them convince you to become more corporate, more polished, more like traditional foundation leadership. The reason you're effective is because you remember what it felt like to be on the other side. Don't lose that." "I won't," he promised. 2 years after that first interview, the one he'd walked away from, the choice that had seemed like disaster, Evan stood in his office on the 19th floor of the Meridian building and looked out over the city. Somewhere out there was the neighborhood where he and Lily still lived, though they'd moved to a slightly larger apartment in the same building when his salary increased. Mrs. Patterson was still their neighbor, still helping with childcare, though now she frequently joked that she'd need to start charging given Evan's fancy new title. Lily was thriving in 4th grade, a confident 10-year-old who'd recently announced she wanted to be either an astronaut or a community organizer. She hadn't decided which yet. Marcus and Riverside had become model partners, featured in multiple case studies about authentic community engagement. And Evan himself, he'd become someone he barely recognized from that desperate morning when he'd stood in a waiting room clutching a worn briefcase and the weight of impossible choices. He'd rebuilt a career, yes, but more importantly, he'd rebuilt a life that honored both his professional capabilities and his fundamental values. A life where being a devoted father and being good at his work weren't competing priorities, but complementary expressions of the same core belief, that people deserve dignity, respect, and support in all their complicated humanity. His phone buzzed with a text from Lily. "Don't forget parent-teacher conferences tonight. Mrs. Rodriguez wants to talk about my science project. Love you." Evan smiled, sent back a heart emoji, and began gathering his things to leave the office. Because this was what success actually looked like, not the title or the salary or the influence, though those things certainly made life easier, but the ability to pick up his daughter from school, to show up for parent-teacher conferences, to be present for the ordinary moments that constituted a childhood, to know that walking away from that interview hadn't cost him everything. It had given him everything that actually mattered. As Evan rode the elevator down to the lobby, he thought about the question that had haunted him during those desperate years after Claire died. How do you survive when the world feels rigged against you? How do you keep going when every system seems designed to make everything harder? And he'd learned, slowly and painfully, that survival wasn't a solo project. It required neighbors like Mrs. Patterson who offered help without judgment, bosses like Victoria who saw potential instead of liability, community partners like Marcus who taught what genuine partnership looked like. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, it required walking away from what looked like security in order to protect what you loved. And discovering that courage like that could open doors you'd never imagined existed. Evan emerged onto the downtown street into late afternoon sunshine. The city moved around him with its usual cacophony, people heading home from work. Students gathered near bus stops, vendors calling out specials, the constant urban symphony of human life intersecting and overlapping. He caught the bus toward Lily's school, found a seat by the window, and watched the neighborhoods transform from sleek commercial district to the residential areas where actual people lived actual lives. And Evan realized, sitting on that bus as the city scrolled past outside the window, that this was the story worth telling. Not the dramatic rescue in the emergency room or the triumphant board presentation, though those moments mattered. But this, the ordinary journey from work to daughter, from professional success to the simple gift of being present. The knowledge that broken things could heal if given time and care. That walking away from security could lead to building something better. That being a good father wasn't a liability in professional spaces, but rather the foundation of understanding what truly mattered. He'd spent 2 years believing he was failing, that his inability to manage both grief and stability and parenthood meant he wasn't enough. But he'd been wrong. He'd been exactly enough. And when Victoria had watched him stand up and walk out of that interview, she hadn't seen failure. She'd seen exactly the kind of person the world needed more of, someone who knew what mattered and had the courage to choose it, even when that choice looked like losing everything. Evan got off the bus at Washington Elementary just as the final bell rang. Lily emerged with her backpack and her bright smile, running toward him like she did every day, and Evan caught her in a hug that held everything he couldn't quite articulate. Gratitude, love, the bone-deep relief of having survived the unsurvivable and discovered that life on the other side could be more than just endurable. It could be genuinely good. "Ready for the parent-teacher conference?" Lily asked, taking his hand as they walked toward the building's main entrance. "Absolutely ready. Think Mrs. Rodriguez has good things to say about your science project?" "Definitely. I worked really hard on it." Lily squeezed his hand. "And Dad? I'm proud of you. I know I say it a lot, but I really mean it. You're doing important things." "You're the most important thing," Evan said, squeezing back. "Everything else is just details." They walked into the school together, father and daughter, survivor and survivor, bound by loss and love and the fierce determination to build lives worth living despite everything that had tried to break them. And Evan understood finally and completely that the morning he'd chosen his child over his future hadn't been the end of anything. It had been the moment when his real future began. A future built not on certainty or perfection, but on the simple revolutionary act of choosing what mattered and trusting that the rest would follow. Sometimes it did. Not always. Not magically. But sometimes, if you were brave enough to walk away from security in order to protect love, and if you were lucky enough to encounter people who recognized that courage for what it was, you discovered that the world contained more grace than you'd been taught to expect, that foundations could be built on trust instead of control, that professional success could coexist with devoted parenthood, that being fully human in all your messy complexity wasn't a liability, but rather the most valuable qualification you could possibly offer. Evan had learned this truth slowly, painfully, through years of struggle and unexpected kindness. And now, as he sat beside his daughter in an elementary school classroom listening to her teacher describe her brilliance and curiosity, he carried that truth forward into whatever came next. Not as a perfect father or a flawless professional, but as someone who'd survived the unsurvivable and learned that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was simply keep showing up, keep choosing love, keep believing that dignity and respect and possibility were worth fighting for even when the world suggested otherwise. That was the real story. Not the dramatic rescue or the career transformation, but the ordinary miracle of survival through connection, of rebuilding through trust, of discovering that walking away could be the first step toward arriving exactly where you needed to be. And as Lily's teacher talked about her daughter's potential, Evan felt something settle in his chest that had been restless for years, the quiet certainty that they were going to be okay. More than okay. They were going to thrive, together, building a life that honored both Claire's memory and their own resilient futures. The world outside the classroom window was the same city it had always been, complicated, unjust, full of both cruelty and unexpected kindness. But Evan saw it differently now, not as a place that had tried to destroy him, but as a landscape full of people trying to survive and thrive and care for each other in whatever ways they could manage. And his job, both at the foundation and as Lily's father, was to make that caring a little easier, a little more possible, a little more dignified for everyone involved. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.